It's been a 10-year anniversary for me too, because it was early 2011 when I, as a patient advocate, became aware of IMI by actually coordinating a grant proposal, what later became EU Party. And I've been with the IMI journey for the past 10 years and see the evolution of patient engagement, not only through EU Party and IMI funded projects and others, but also how IMI evolved over time to actually involve patients all across the board, from let's say the internal decisions over the calls, over all the projects that IMI has funded. I'd like to thank for that. What I want to do in the next couple of minutes is talk a bit about the challenge vision and the value of meaningful patient engagement in collaborative research projects. But this sounds very hypothetical, but I'm trying to be very pragmatic, because what we all ask ourselves is, how can we actually get engaged? How do we find ourselves together with researchers and industry and academia and other players to actually do collaborative projects that work on a pre-competitive basis, like in a framework of IMI, which I would say worldwide is pretty unique. So that's what I'm going to speak about, but I would like to take one step back first. And if we move to the next slide, we need to think back, why should academic researchers and industry and regulators really involve patient advocates in their collaborative research projects? Because we could assume that we all are patients somehow, and couldn't we just do it for the patients instead of with the patients? But we need to move away from glossy statements on patient centricity towards real involvement of patients in plans, in actions, and in outcomes of research projects, because patients are the ones that have the best insights into day-to-day reality of patients. They understand what is the real unmet need, not just the clinical unmet needs, but what do patients and their families really need? What are the patient preferences when you have the difficult trade-off in healthcare between the bad and the ugly? How do you deal between benefit and risk, and what is really patient benefit and patient risk, and not risk to the providers of healthcare? And what is the real value? Does a research project really provide value to the patients that should be benefiting from healthcare in the end? And of course, we need innovation. We need innovation, but at the same time, we don't need waste of resources. And that's why patient engagement can really drive better clinical trials, better services, better info resources. And in the end, this leads to wiser investment of very limited resources. Even though we have huge funding programs, still the resources are so limited, so we can't really afford to waste them by making projects that don't deliver towards patients' needs. And in the end, this is all about data, so we need to generate data that's really meaningful. On the next slide, you can actually see that this is not a new invention. This is a timeline of patient engagement since the early 1990s, and we need to credit the HIV community for, let's say, paving the way for patient engagement in the early 1990s, when they were not satisfied with the current status quo and were challenging the system and say, we need to be part of the discussions when decisions are being taken about us. And that evolved over all the years. In 2005, the EMA started to involve patients. In 2009, I think IMI started the first patient engagement activities. And you can all see these different blurbs, and I can't explain them all, but with patient-focused medicine development, which was founded almost at the same time like EU Party in 2012. And a lot of developments in the FDA about patient engagement. And of course, a very strong strengthening of efforts through the patient pool in IMI and so on in 2019. You can see this has been a continuum, and this has been a global movement. So it's not something where a new fashion. That's been something that is a product of the last 30 years. And on the next slide, this is something we've published in the framework of the EU Party project, is when people are saying, so how and where can I get meaningful patient input into the clinical development or research lifecycle? And you can actually see the whole continuum. And I could explain each of these bullets which are in there, from setting the right research priorities, over protocol design and practical considerations on running studies over the whole informed consent and ethics review process. Then when studies are run, trial steering committees, data safety monitoring committees, and then the whole regulatory sphere if it's a study that actually delivers to regulatory questions. It's a whole continuum, and each of these points are practical things where the HIV community has been providing input for about 3 decades, and where I would say cancer has been very active in the last 10 to 15, and some rare diseases as well. So they're very practical guidance. If you're asking, where can I get meaningful input into my research? This is the roadmap to look at. If we go to the next slide, you can actually see some examples, and that's where you can see the evolution. I've just picked some of the IMI funded projects and the patient organizations that have been involved in those projects. I'm involved, for example, in Harmony. I've been involved in EUPADI myself, and you're going to hear from a number of examples of the other speakers where there has been in-depth patient involvement. And when IMI made this first survey, I think it was in 2018, about 20% of the 135 IMI projects had patient organizations in the consortium and 30% in the patient advisory boards. And you can see this last number has actually grown to 60% in 2021. So you can see the evolution, and I would say almost all new projects that are being applied for in the IMI program, but also in Horizon Europe and others, have some form of patient involvement. So this is something that you have to do to be successful when you're applying for grants. On the next slide, I just wanted to highlight a bit of the tools that are out there, because we've started with nothing in the early 2000s. There were no frameworks for patient engagement. Everyone was asking, how can we do that? And I mean, the IMI funded projects, EUPADI and Harmony, as well as the global movement or initiative PFMD, have done a tremendous lot of tools and frameworks and trainings and whatever, from the EUPADI trainings that Ellie has outlined earlier on, over patient engagement trainings for industry by PFMD, the toolbox in 9 languages of EUPADI on the internet, the national platforms of EUPADI in, I think, I don't know how many countries, 18, I think, all the guidance documents that Paradigm has produced and so on, they're all open access. So if you want to move to the point, how do I do it? That's where it is. You just need to go to these websites and you can find these resources. And very, very important, and that's where I would say the IMI program has been really unique, is about the EUPADI program, because it has been a game changer, because it wasn't strengthening healthcare stakeholders to engage patients, it were strengthening and training the patient community to be on equal eye level. Because like me, I'm a business person. I had no idea about medicine until I got cancer. So I had to learn the hard way how research works, and EUPADI does that in a structured way today. On the next slide, actually, I want to fill the missing gap there, because of course, the questions that we get very often, whether you're working for a funding institution like IMI, or whether you're working for an academic institution, or whether you're a patient organization, is how do you deal with consortia projects? We have 30 different consortium members. In what are the models? Is it the typical example of an advisory board where I just include a patient advocate as an advisor and that's it, box ticked? Or are there different models? How do I plan for patient engagement? How do I implement it? How do I operationalize it? How do I budget it and whatever? And that's why we as patient advocates, together with the Swiss Rising Tide Foundation, we have built an applicant's guide for a public consortia, actually to think about a checklist when planning patient engagement, examples of potential contributions of patients in such projects, organizational models within a consortium, identification of the right patient organization, how do you find patient organizations in the field, how do you build a patient involvement plan, and so on. And that's also available on the Rising Tide Foundation since June. So this is the missing bit. If you're thinking about applying for IMI funds and you want to know what are the different models for your research projects that could work, this guide might be helpful for you. And just to pick out on the next slide, just to pick out some one thing of that, I mean, I said it, the default model is build a patient advisory board. But while this is interesting and sometimes very informative, the impact and the influence on the direction of a project is usually quite limited, because you can take advice or you can ignore it. in the end, it doesn't have any consequences if the patient community really wants to do things. Or feels the direction should be different. That's why over the years there have been different models that have emerged. The first one is, of course, project coordinator, like in Paradigm or EUPADI. That's where the European Patients Forum and other patient organizations were the leadership, were coordinating the projects. This is, of course, very high impact, but of course, very high effort for the patient community. You could have patient advocates as part of the steering committee. You could have them as work package leaders. You could have them as research project members, where their work that they contribute to the different work packages is being funded. You can have a patient involvement hub that coordinates all the different patient contributions, which I'm going to explain in a moment. The associated project partner, which are usually not funded but associated to the project, or the typical advisory role. And these models are a bit more described in the guide, but it's important when you think about applying for IMI funds, think about what is the right model to maximize patient input, influence on the direction which your research project is going to take. And I'm not saying this is the golden model, but I'm just saying there are different models you can choose from today. And if I just explain the patient involvement hub, if you just click for a moment, this one, then I'm going to explain that in the example of a project which I'm engaged in, which is described on the next slide. It's the IMI Harmony Alliance. So it's consisting of two IMI projects, IMI Harmony and IMI Harmony Plus. It's the first and largest public-private partnership for big data in hematology. It's a huge project with a lot of different players, from academia, from industry, from NGOs, and so on, and from regulators. And it targets 14 different blood cancers, which you can see there. But what you can see in the graph below, that's the hub model which you have implemented. Because usually for patient organizations, it's totally crazy to actually do the administrative burden for a project when you're not really involved a lot. And that's why one organization is a consortium member, and all the other pan-European umbrellas are then delivering through the organization into the different work packages, like definition of core outcome sets, the research proposals, doing master classes for the patient organizations and for the key opinion leaders, providing input into the de-identification mechanisms on big data or the ethical framework, and so on. So you can see this is a lived example which you can look at. If we move to the next slide, I just want to say and end with more or less that, all essential ingredients are there. So we have the frameworks, we have the collaborative spirit, we have political support. The cancer missions are putting patient engagement very, very strongly, and others are too. We have all the tools. We have the capacity to engage with trainings from PFMD and EUPADI. So all the essential ingredients are there. Next slide, please. So what you need to decide is, do you want to go for the low-hanging fruit, easy route, advisory board, get a patient in, box ticked, or do you want to go for the high-hanging fruit because you're really interested to deliver on patient needs? And that, of course, needs a plan, early engagement, and the right model for your collaboration project. So with that, I'd like to end at the last slide and say all essential ingredients are here. Let's engage, use the tools, and we're going to hear more examples in a moment. Thank you so much.